United Nations Association here in Tunbridge Wells and Wealden. We have two speakers, and our first speaker is Dr. Auqaab Malik. Auqaab Malik is a British-born academic who studied the Afghan conflict as part of his King's College doctorate in strategic and nuclear studies. He then taught at the National Defence University in Islamabad as a visiting assistant professor of strategic studies, and he advised the Pakistan government on the Taliban. His most recent posting was in the United States as the winner of the Fulbright Scholar Award at the Elliott School for International Affairs, George Washington University. Discussions earlier this year about the Taliban, in which he took part for the Pakistan television network, may be seen on YouTube. So over to you, Auqaab.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you for inviting me to give this little introduction of what I think is happening in Afghanistan. During my PhD times, before I really begin the presentation that I'd like to, as in a proper lecture maybe, I'd just like to say that I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, embedded in the late 90s when I was doing my PhD. And I got a good insight as to who the Taliban were, primarily because I had no choice but to engage with them, because I couldn't roam around the country at all without them knowing. And so I had access throughout the country as well in doing so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to initiate, share a screen where you'll be able to see me in the corner somewhere. And then I'll go through a presentation. It's a typical presentation that a professor would give, most likely than not, but it allows you to have some visual effect to see what I'm talking about rather than let it fly over your head, so you can see it visually as well as hear me through the audio. So I'll begin with that now. Although Pete needs to enable sharing. There we go. I'm going to begin the presentation now. I hope you can see this. Is everything okay? You can see this?
Yeah, we can see your screen, Auqaab. Yeah.
That's excellent then. So I'll carry on with that and put this out of the way. Right then. So I'll be talking about Afghanistan, the Taliban, challenges, solutions, maybe aspects of the future. But I wouldn't give a really grounded understanding in the sense that Marzia will later on, because she's been an activist on the ground. My main area is as a geostrategist, so I would give the wider picture and where we can see it going from there. And I think Marzia may be able to complement that from the underground realities as far as an activist is concerned. So I would give the wider picture, and she would hone into present-day life for ordinary people rather than the geopolitics of it. I think it allows you to see both aspects of Afghanistan and where it's going, if it is at all. So I'll be talking about these issues here rapidly. So unfortunately, my graphics are taking a lot longer than I expected. As with all lectures that I provide, I do provide a disclaimer, which is to indicate that these are my personal views and do not represent the Liberal Democrats or any other institution.
Auqaab, sorry to cut across, but I'm seeing the first slide. I don't know if everyone else is.
Yes, I'm not seeing the slideshow. I'm seeing.
Can't see the slides.
We're just on the first slide at the moment.
Are you?
Yeah, that's right. We can all see it. Well, at least I can.
And
you can see the first slide, but you can't see the others.
We can see the others down the side of the screen. Your first slide isn't filling the screen.
All right, I'm on a presentation, a full screen here. Is that not occurring?
It's not on our screen.
No, it isn't.
So something's obviously gone wrong, because
maybe if you're on a second screen or something, then.
Well, let me try this again in a different form.
It's all right. You've moved on to your fourth slide now.
Mm-hmm.
You're on your fourth slide.
I think what I can do is go on to the main screen share. Are we good here?
Yes, there we go. That's it.
That's better.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll talk about the Taliban initially. In essence, just for those people who are unaware, the Taliban arose during the bitter civil war between the Mujahideen groups after the Soviet Union had left and the communist PDPA had collapsed. And by 1996, they had an aggressive campaign which they were able to take over Kabul and much of the country, around 95% of the country. One important aspect of the US, when it started really honing in on what the Taliban actually was, prior to that, they were quite aloof about the Taliban and let them be as it would be, was the Trade Center bombings in 1998. And in doing so, the US targeted parts of Afghanistan, certain training camps of Al-Qaeda and other militant groups in Afghanistan, in the east of Afghanistan. However, the Al-Qaeda continued to operate in Afghanistan after that, hidden away from the satellites, for example. Nevertheless, by 2001, 9/11 occurred, primarily because they were able to continue training operatives from around the world, and they were based primarily in Afghanistan and other countries, but they were able to be operational unhindered in Afghanistan at that point in time. Now, that's basic history, and I want to get you back to exactly, I'm not going to really talk about what happened over the 20 years, but I would like to, and the consequence of the US invasion and the occupation and the bad things about it or the good things about it. But I would like to talk about what did happen that was in the benefit of Afghanistan. For example, spurring economic and industrial growth through foreign direct investment, employment opportunities for large sections of the population, for example, which were impoverished to a large extent, especially after so many years, 30 years of war by that time. Afghanistan availed opportunities from the US in many different sectors, such as energy, technology, development, education, and transportation. As far as transportation is concerned, the US and allied forces were able to develop roads, minimal railway networks, because it's not very conducive for that environment to that extent, but they did allow for some of that to occur. Energy infrastructure as well as commercial infrastructure to allow trading. But more importantly, I think, is the political aspect, where they encourage and emancipation of females, political participation, and the education to allow them to integrate into society when they were not able to. After 20 years of war and the Taliban's imposition of harsh strictures, even in Kabul at that particular time, when they had banned females from having employment, there was a UN report that I read a while back. Just in Kabul, there were 44,000 war widows, and many of them could not only seek employment and had to sustain their families through things such as prostitution, because there was no choice in that. So we're not going to be moralistic in this respect. We need to appreciate and understand the reasoning behind why society was pretty dumbed down and imprisoned in a way. The US, during the Taliban time, the US allowed that to open up significantly. And there was a development of democratic governance structures, which is very important here, because although democracy in essence was an alien concept to them, it's become part of the social norm and the psyche amongst the youth, especially, which are the large percentage of the population and the rest of the population. And that is a demand that they continue to have. During the Taliban takeover, which was quite rapid, they shocked the world, but they were able to take over so quickly, primarily because they had built up a network of sympathizers and supporters who were in leading positions, such as tribal elders and people in administration around the country. Generally, there wasn't much fighting, and that's why the whole world was pretty shocked at the fall of the Afghan governance structure and the army in itself, because a lot of the army was actually not there. It was an invisible army. Largely in numbers, but largely in numbers that were fictitious to maintain funding, for example. And the Taliban were able to exploit this. And they had large numbers of people within the military that were already sympathetic to them and already on their side. But as they took Kabul over, within a matter of a day or two, they banned females immediately from work and school. And this was a reimagining of Afghanistan. They said that they would not do the same thing as they did before, that they had learned their lesson. But unfortunately, that doing this was a repetition of what they had done before. And it was an immediate shock around the world that we're going to come into something that was the same as before. And then the focus of Afghanistan would be this. I think a lot of the media has talked about this. However, they did initiate a charm offensive to gain recognition that they would change things slowly. There has been little change, but it's not in the keeping of what they mentioned. And they said that they would allow females to participate, for example, within the governance structure. Although for the interim government, they instituted a 55-member cabinet of all male cabinet. So this is the contradiction again. So when you get a feel for this, you realize that they're just saying things on the surface to appease the Western population and the rest of the world so that they can carry on with what they really want to do, which is to put Afghanistan back into a very strict form of Islamic Sharia that is centuries behind the modern world. And the current developments. Now, I'm going to talk about how this impacts Afghanistan. What are the challenges? Challenges are the same as any other country. Agriculture, jobs, strategic issues with the defense of their borders, for example, infrastructure building. They are very lucky in that they've got a whole country that has been built up over the last 20 years, and it hasn't really been significantly destroyed. Only small, tiny parts of it where there was some conflict, but largely it's intact. So they've taken over a generally forward-looking country with modern infrastructure in certain capitals around, provincial capitals around the country and Kabul. As with any other country, they have energy shortages and water, especially in that region, and they have defense and security issues, education and training. And these are the things that we need to understand, that they are very much like any other country. The Taliban took over a country, yet I don't think they were prepared to understand how large a matter this really is, to take over a country and to institute change in the way they want to, while continuing to govern the country on a level platform to allow it to progress. And no wonder we've had so many issues with food shortages, for example, lack of money in the banks. People are becoming, especially over the winter now, are going to have immense problems, and there may be a humanitarian disaster as a result. Now, I want to give you an understanding about what's going on in the world. The US, the largest economic power in the world. There are other economic powers in Asia, for example, Russia, China, India, and Japan. And then you've got Afghanistan, a tiny economic country. What I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't require military assets to push Afghanistan in the right direction. It requires money and correct thinking and coordination amongst these large powers. And that's what I want to go into for the rest of the topic in the geostrategic sense. Unfortunately, we're faced with a different evolving dynamic in the geostrategic environment in the world, where we see a geostrategic, not just economic competition, but a geostrategic competition between the two largest economic powers. And China can be seen as the third largest military power also, where their interests and influence contradict each other around the world. And Afghanistan is placed in the middle of this to an extent. And so it's going to be very difficult for coordination to occur. Suspicion, tension, misunderstanding, and dishonesty or lack of trust is a forecourt of this environment right now, especially for a country like Afghanistan that it faces. So if it's going to enable itself to develop in that country, it's going to have to learn how to play these different parties off, I think. And the Taliban are adept at doing this to an extent, but there are now changing global realities, global realignments. Climate change is a large focus of our future economic sustenance. How do we enable our economies to change in the direction for sustainable development so that it encompasses positive change for the climate, for example? We also have the rise of Asia as an economic powerhouse. The whole of the Asian continent, large economies are growing. There is a conflict of interest in this respect also, because I find that other countries feel that their economic basis is ebbing away from them, and that can lead to conflict also. So this is a geostrategic environment, but there's also regional entanglements here between, for example, China and India, the two large powers in Asia here, that are comparatively close to Afghanistan, or were. Now, India has pushed away from Afghanistan now because it feels that the Pakistani influence in Afghanistan is much stronger than theirs, obviously, and as a result, it's going to be in the opposite side. China is hedging its bets at the moment. But again, we have competition, geostrategic competition, regional competition, but these are not the only parties. There is Iran vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, Pakistan vis-a-vis India, some of the Central Asian states that may institute some interference again to lead to instability that can continue the war as it was before, which I don't think anybody wants. China has introduced the idea and had talks with the Taliban about the idea of including the Taliban, or should I say Afghanistan, within the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, it's a fluid situation as far as Afghanistan is concerned. There's no certainty. There never really was. So China will maintain economic contact with the Taliban and the people of Afghanistan, with exchanges of people to allow them to interact. But I think they're not going to really invest until they find that the Taliban has settled down. They have their own conditions as well. Yet, there's a linchpin here. China wants to be a leading economic power, and largely it depends on rare earth minerals and the control of that environment. So does United States, which is a lesser party to that. And as a result, I think China sees this crop of future empowerment through rare earth minerals for future technologies and will maintain contact one way or another. But it's also concerned about the potential rise of increased militancy and extremism and support of non-state actors, for example, such as ETIM, that is the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is based in the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province of the western province of China, for example. I know they fear the uprise of militancy and extremist attacks and terrorist attacks within China. So they're going to keep a careful eye on this and put some pressure on the Taliban, without a doubt, through economic means to enable them to maintain the lack of presence of these people in Afghanistan so they don't use it as a base. I think this is also the case and the worry of many Western capitals and countries surrounding Afghanistan, the neighboring countries surrounding Afghanistan, that it becomes a haven for terrorists again. So there's a lot of concern in this respect in the future. Now, there are many convergences when it comes to economics. In general, countries align with each other. They interconnect with economic corridors. They learn to trade with each other. They have interests with each other. So damaging these interests damages each other. And that allows economic development of Afghanistan, for example, and other countries around the area. Afghanistan is a focal point, for example, for Central Asian energy to come to India or Pakistan or the Middle East, for example. But that's not been the case primarily because of the existing war or the pre-existing war up to this point. Ordinarily, you would think that economic development would provide liberalization through economic interdependence. However, I have to also maintain the idea that this may not occur primarily because if China gets involved, they don't really care about how a country governs itself. Rather, they consider their own economic interests, how they can siphon off the money where they need to. And so they won't impose any real strictures as far as governance structure is concerned, or conditions, for example, on the way the Taliban govern their own country, as long as they limit extremists from using Afghanistan as a base. So how do we contain this extremism? Lately, we've come across ISIS in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria. And by 2015, when ISIS was quite strong in the Middle East, they started forming in Afghanistan, and it was called Islamic State Khorasan. It was known as Khorasan encompasses large parts of Asia, India, and Central Asia, but they're focusing on Afghanistan. And they were largely people from Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, who were defeated thoroughly by the Pakistan armed forces during the counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism campaigns in 2014 and 15. So they were pushed away and out of Pakistan. And they found that the only way they could exist was to be part of Afghanistan. But they had differences of opinion and the way they want to conduct themselves, because the campaign of the Taliban was focused primarily on changing the whole governance structure in Pakistan. So they aligned with Islamic State Khorasan and became the major foundations of that organization, which operates in northern and eastern Afghanistan. Islamic State Khorasan has been hostile in that respect to Taliban because a matter of territorial gain and influence in certain regions. They want now to have more political say in the governance of Afghanistan and find that the Taliban are more going to compromise with the West, but they do not want to. So as a result, the ISK is much more extreme in their version, dominating primarily from the Wahhabi Salafist grouping from Arabia and their philosophy, although they are still Deobandi predominantly, which is what the Taliban espouse. The Deobandi ideas of Islam, their strict interpretation of Islamic Sharia, for example, the literal interpretation of what Islam is. Nevertheless, over the last couple of months, the Taliban have had a whole campaign against the Islamic State. And as a result, they've already rounded up over 600, and that was in October. And even more so, they have campaigns around the country where they're trying to contain them. But we all know about the airport attack and how devastating that was. Yet we don't really hear about the continued attacks by Islamic State around Afghanistan, and especially in the capital. Yet again, the potential for extremists to exploit vacuums that the Taliban hasn't complete control of the rest of the country, because they're still trying to organize themselves, is a worrisome feature of Afghanistan in the present era now, where other Islamic groups or other extremist groups with different ideas may begin to form or base themselves from around the different areas. Now, it has been recognized that Islamic State in Arabia, in Iraq and Syria, being voluntarily coming to Afghanistan because they see this as a new front in their war against the West. So that is worrisome for the future. One of the things that we're worried about also, and it's highlighted again and again, and I think it's very important because it's half the population, is emancipation of females. Immediately upon securing Afghanistan, girls' schools were closed down. Now, there is some sign of a release of tension where the Taliban says that about 75% of the girls' schools are opening up. But I suspect that most of these are for younger girls and not high schools and universities where ladies and females of a higher age, above 18, 20, for example, can attend university in sync with their male colleagues, for example. So we have to keep an eye on that. Although gaining information about that is very difficult at this moment in time. Also, political participation. The new UNDP report that came out recently within the last few weeks indicated that the Afghan economy will not recover without female participation. But they're unable to return. In fact, in 2019, already Afghanistan was 166 out of 167 in the UN Gender Index, which means second from the bottom. You can imagine how difficult it will be now. But it also indicated the contribution of educated women in Afghanistan is the productivity is much higher than that of men of the same level of education. So you can understand the contribution that females can have for the future of Afghanistan. Female politicians in the pre-Taliban government, during the Afghan government, prior to the Taliban, there were 89 MPs and 13 cabinet ministers. Right now, there are 0 females. So we need to make sure that continuous pressure is made and put on the Taliban to have an inclusive, wide-ranging, ethnic, gender-based governance structure. The situation of free media, for example, is also very critical. Taliban have limited free expression under the threat of violence. Many journalists have been beaten. Some have even been killed. Unlikely to change in the near future because they feel that, and I understand the Taliban thinking, that I think that they feel that until they have a secure hold on the country completely, that they're not going to allow free expression to occur or anybody to be critical of them or to formulate or form any form of opposition as a result. So what is the future about? We're coming to the end of this. Taliban's demands mutual needs. They expect that the world community will understand them and provide for them to some extent. But they fail to realize that they have taken over a governance structure themselves by force. And in doing so, there is no equality. There is no obligation of the international community to provide in the literal sense, although the moral implications, obviously, the global community will. Yet the Taliban wants recognition and it wants commitment from other countries. Yet it also wants non-interference and sovereign equality, meaning that the country of Afghanistan under the Taliban has equal basis as any other country. And that's hard to gain, but this is what they want. So we've got something to play with, I think, in the future, in the sense that they want something and we want something in the rest of the world. And that is, they want mutual respect for their sovereign and territorial integrity. They want mutual non-aggression. They want non-interference in their internal affairs. They want mutual benefit of trade, of air trade, and peaceful coexistence like any other country. But how do we ensure that they can get that whilst we get what we want? Because they're part of the global community. And I find that the only real way that we're going to be able to do this is to incentivize cooperation. If they want to have certain trade and economic basis or recognition, they must do certain things. For example, female emancipation, allowing females at all levels to go on an equal basis to school and have education and work opportunities and political participation, and media freedom is essential. Although I find that that's going to be quite difficult because they won't allow criticism of who they are. Also, the world is worried about extremist bases. Now, we know that the Islamic State is very prominent in Afghanistan at this moment in time, and now it could increase. So I think that we could cooperate on this, maybe co-opt the Taliban into working with us around the world into limiting any extremist formation or access to any vacuum in political control around that country by targeting militancy, for example. That would mean that the Taliban has to liberalize to some extent. I think that's a long-term goal that we have, and we can have a roadmap toward this extent. And regional cooperation in this respect is essential, meaning Pakistan, Central Asian countries, Iran, India even, and Saudi Arabia must cooperate with each other. But we know how difficult that's going to be. But I find that there's no other option in this respect. Finally, as I mentioned, enhanced trade via BRI. The Chinese can impose strict conditions for their potential for trade. Central Asian energy potential, where Afghanistan can receive full energy resources from Central Asian countries, for example, and interlink their network and grids within that region. That could be incentivized also. Extra-regional integration is a potential, but it won't occur, I feel, unless we utilize the resources that we have and use this leverage upon them to change. I think that the future depends on cooperation amongst the larger powers. But then again, I did mention that there is economic and strategic competition amongst the largest powers in the neighborhood and the extra-regional powers, meaning further away, such as China and the United States, or Russia, for example. So this is what we really need to focus on in the future. In order for the Taliban to liberalize to some extent, if they want recognition, they have to earn it. And I believe that's the way forward. And I think internationally, as I showed you the point where you had massive economic power surrounding Afghanistan, that leverage can be absolutely used. And it should be used to the best extent, to the benefit of the population in Afghanistan in every which way. Thank you.
Round of applause.
And now to the questions. Did I do it in time? I think.
Time kept very well. Thanks, Auqaab. So we've got about
I could
just
over down.
just over 10 minutes, really. So feel free to put your questions for Auqaab in the chat. There's been a comment, Auqaab, which I'll sort of put to you for your response from Paula, who's talked about saying the statistics seem to bear out that very little was in reality delivered for the poor and for girls' education, and that possibly building an infrastructure were mainly for the benefit of as Paul puts it, invading forces from the West. So I think sort of to spark a bit of a discussion there. What's your view on that?
So you're saying that statistics indicate that there was less infrastructure built by over 20 years.
I can see Leslie's raised her hand. I don't know if Leslie, if you want to sort of jump in at this point.
Well, I was in Afghanistan only a couple of times, and that was between 2001 and 2006, and have just followed from a distance. But I have to say, I think the progress that was made on girls and women's education, empowerment, all the things that, and first of all, thank you very much for a superb lecture. I should have started by saying that. But I think there was a lot of progress made, but yeah, we were starting from a low base, and it was going to take longer than 20 years. I mean, we know how difficult getting our schools in order is and how long it takes. So I don't agree with Paula on this particular point. For whatever reasons, the fact was a lot of progress was made, amazing progress in a way, but of course, mainly in the cities, I think. But I don't know, Auqaab would know better. I was only in Kabul and in Bamiyan, so I wasn't in other areas.
No, I completely agree, actually, Leslie, that the progress can't be compared to England, for example, or can't be compared to a Western country or more developed country. Afghanistan is in the lowest index as far as economic powers are concerned. It's right at the bottom list, one of the poorest countries in the world. However, the level of progress that's occurred would not have occurred otherwise had the Taliban in power for continuous point. Now, I'm not going to argue about whether it was rational for the US to invade and kick them out. I think there would have been a better way to do things because we've come back to square one again. So I think that we need to try to maintain the momentum that we've made over the last 20 years for the level of education for females, for example, especially. Primarily because if we stop focusing on this, there's going to be a backtrack. And that backtrack could be so significant that it could take generations, maybe, to come back to this point, because that was forced. Yes, by foreign occupation. There's no doubt about that. I have my own particular opinions of whether the US should have invaded or not and how they came about it. But there was a lot of bloodlust at that time. And President Bush wanted an excuse to get into that region so he could focus on Iraq eventually anyway. He left that, and then Taliban became stronger as a result. But that's a long story. The point of the matter is that there was a lot of disunity, disjointed strategy making, and ad hocism in Afghanistan by the Americans throughout this 20 years. They didn't know where they wanted to go. Nobody knew where they really wanted to do. As soon as Obama said that they were leaving, that was the end of the war. The Taliban had essentially won since that point because a power doesn't leave without actually accomplishing all its objectives. So this was one of the things that we should celebrate, that was positive, and we should try to maintain that. Thank you.
Thank you, Auqaab. Paula, I can see you've got a hand up. I'm just conscious that we've got a lot of questions, if that's okay, unless you've got a really quick response.
Well, I was just going to say that the American invasion actually destroyed a hell of a lot of Afghanistan, but I was also going to thank our speaker for what I thought was a very measured analysis, and Leslie too, because she's been to Afghanistan and I haven't, so I'm just trading on what I remember of the Soviet Union doing all those years ago and being blamed for it. And for goodness sake, Afghanistan was on its border, whereas I really don't know what the West are doing over there. But I think our speakers kind of said that anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Just pop yourself back on. Sorry, Paula. If you just pop yourself back on mute, that'd be great. So just a couple of questions come in, Auqaab as well. So talking about trade. So there was a question about what it is that actually in terms of resources that Afghanistan would trade.
Okay, so Afghanistan, as you can understand, is a very poor country. It's not really been trading anything. It's landlocked, so it doesn't have any ports, for example. To be able to trade freely, it has to go through Pakistan or Iran, or maybe some of the Central Asian countries. But if it wants to get out to the wider world, it's going to be through Iran and Pakistan. There is an Afghan Transit Trade Treaty between Pakistan and Afghanistan where goods can come in through Pakistan that are tax-free and reach the border in Afghanistan and then tax at that point, which allows and facilitates some trade. But there is always going to be a leverage against them. They have fruits and nuts, but this is what I talked about. Rare earth minerals have been found. Now, for example, the Chinese have invested, I think, about $3 billion already in 2008 in a copper mine in northern Afghanistan called the Mass Ainak copper mine. But because of the continued war, because of the instability, they weren't really able to do anything. So they're really keenly looking at these issues. Afghanistan has a wealth of mineral deposits, and they've estimated between 1 and 3 trillion of certain types of rare earth minerals, but there are many more other types of minerals as well, and metallurgical issues that they can deal with. But they've got to learn to exploit this. That means international companies must come in. This is where peace and stability is required for that country and not war, primarily because multinationals are not going to go into an environment where there is instability because their money's at stake. They're not going to go to a country where they can't find profit for 10 years, for example. They need to have some security, and the same is true for China. I think, although it's the Taliban, the fact is they did win the war. For 20 years. They fought against the Americans, as well as around 48 other countries, by the way. And in doing so, they maintained themselves, and they were always going to do that. They had the long war, they said. They had the long game, they said, and they were going to maintain that. And at the end, the public supported them generally. At least the leadership did to an extent, and filtered to their side because they realized nobody wants to go into a civil war. And they don't want the country to be disrupted again. But they also wanted indigenous Afghanistan to be occupied by indigenous Afghanis and not by foreign occupation in any way whatsoever. And the Afghans, especially the Pashtun, are very proud people in that respect. Throughout history, it's known they don't like foreigners dictating terms to them. And they've won every war up to this point, right from prehistory. So you can, if you go into a country like that, you're going to expect certain outcomes. That this was not a long-term plan, that US didn't think about the long-term and were on an ad hoc basis throughout every year. They didn't know what they were going to do until they finally pulled out. I think it was inevitable that was going to happen. Now what's going to happen is that they've got a not so friendly government in Afghanistan in the form of Taliban, but things can change. New enemies arise and the Taliban can be co-opted in that. For example, look at the United States and Vietnam, former bitter enemies, now trading partners. Things can change over time. It's a matter of how you negotiate with other people and interest. International relations is all about interests of a particular country. At one point, they could be enemies. Tomorrow, they could be friends. It's never going to be static. It's always going to be fluid in that respect. I think it's in the interest of the Taliban to recognize the international community and recognize that they have a lot to gain if they cooperate. They're not giving that much up. But I think they're also trying to figure out how they're going to govern the country. They're not professional technocrats or diplomats in that respect. They're fighters, largely, commanders on the ground. So they need educated people with them and advice. So this is where we have an opportunity to actually leverage that country to an extent for the benefit of the future of Afghanistan and the people there.
Great. Thank you, Auqaab. We've got time for one more. And then there are a few more questions in the chat box. So what I'm going to ask is, once you've sort of finished your stint, Auqaab, if you wouldn't mind maybe responding to those in the chat, just because we'll move on to Marzia.
Okay.
But Suhail, do you want to come off mute and just ask your question?
Sure. Thank you very much, Auqaab. That was an excellent talk. I have a question, but just before that, I just wanted to say last night I watched on YouTube Rory Stewart's 2-part series on Afghanistan and the history of the last 100 years.
Could you just increase your volume a little bit? Sorry, it's difficult to hear through my phone.
Yeah. last, can you hear me now?
A lot better, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to say that the Rory Stewart's documentary on the last 100 years of Afghanistan was quite good. It was on BBC about the three great powers trying to occupy it and failed to do so. And the thing is, why would they succeed? I mean, who would want foreigners coming into your country with guns, trying to change your country in the foreigners' mind, model? So, but my question is, if Afghanistan is next to Pakistan and next to Iran, and many of the people seem to be talking in the same cultural and linguistic mode. So how could Pakistan make a difference to Afghanistan? How could Iran make a difference to Afghanistan from a people perspective?
No, excellent. I mean, I think for each country, for example, with the exception of China, China predominantly provides more electronic goods at a cheaper basis. That's why it's a large trading partner for them rather than food goods and things. However, yeah, I think you're correct in this. Pakistan has a large stake in the future stability of Afghanistan for its own needs and own interests as well. It doesn't want an enemy, or it doesn't want instability in that environment. And it wants to clamp down on extremism in Afghanistan, especially ISIS-K and the resurgence of Taliban Pakistan, who are now based in the eastern provinces of Afghanistan. So it is important that these two countries cooperate to a large extent, and so too for Iran. So I think a tripartite pact and understanding between these countries, including maybe the Central Asian countries such as Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, could get involved in this respect as well as Kyrgyzstan. So to understand their commonality in creating a better environment for that country, it is mutual interest. I think that needs to be understood. However, like I mentioned, there are parties in the slightly wider environment that would not be appreciative of this. Saudi does not want Iran to move forward. India does not want Pakistan to move forward. And so they may cause obstacles to this extent by empowering certain other forces within Afghanistan that could cause problems. So this is where negotiations can't just be neighbors. It must be some countries wider afield, and they must take part in that to have an understanding that instability in Afghanistan is absolutely detrimental to India, for example. Future, I think there needs to be a recognition that they've got to work in this respect, and we have an opportunity now to do something, as we did before, but there was an occupying power. Now we have to look at this being 2001 again, and how are we going to do it differently? And it was mentioned, nobody wants countries to come in with guns and occupy them. I don't think anybody wants that. They want to be free. Coming with open arms and understanding is a better way to do this. And I think this is the way we need to see it, and reduce external interference from all these parties, which are external interference for the benefit of their interests against other parties that are externally interfering in Afghanistan as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Auqaab. Unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. So as I mentioned, if you're able to just take a look in the chat, and do you have anything to add on this one?
Okay, about resistance within Afghanistan. The thing about this is that you've got to remember that for 20 years, largely most of the West, 40, 50 countries were at war with the Taliban, and the Taliban won. And the fact of the matter is that they generally have secured, unless you want Afghanistan to fall apart into a bitter civil war again, yes, that can happen, but that war won't end again. And that could lead to a disastrous situation. And I think people are blinded. I mean, I don't support the Taliban in any way whatsoever, but they're blinded by the fact that their animosity towards the Taliban, they don't see what's actually happened. Largely, after 40 years, more than 40 years, the war has ended. 43 years of war has ended. It's a big deal. But it could reoccur. This may just be a transition point. I think the people who have grown up in that environment, faced it, haven't seen real peace in that environment. We should give that a shot. I think I agree with the person earlier who said, why did the Americans go in? Well, that was their decision. They went in. I would have seen it differently. I was appalled at the fact that they went in and bombarded everywhere without looking at really who they were bombarding, what would happen. There was no foresight as far as the future was concerned. They just wanted to attack, but then they felt that they had to stay there. The problem here is that you start from square one again. If that hadn't occurred, and maybe the Taliban would be out now. Generally, what happens is that when there is economic development in a particular country, if that development is allowed, by the way, I don't think the Taliban are resistant to that, because it is a cultural facet of, for example, the Pashtun, who they largely are, that they trade a lot, they work towards business. That development has benefits and dividends. For example, economic benefits allow the country to develop in that respect, but it has to occur within a peaceful environment. Foreign countries and foreign companies, international companies, want to have another group of people to invest with, and that provides more dividends. The thing is, you need peace and stability for that, not continuous war. And I'm not for continuous war anymore. The fact of the matter is, whatever happened has happened. Do we have to live with the Taliban? Or can we? I practiced Aikido for a long time, and I learned from a young age that the best way to deal with an opponent is not to come head on with force. It is to redirect the force against themselves and maybe change them in that respect. And I think that could be the best way. And I've explained throughout the talk and afterwards that the better way to do this is to utilize economic dividends, economic leverage to push them in a different direction, to explain to them. But by giving force, you're going to have a very strong resistance. The Pashtun are known for this, that if you come with arms and weapons, they're going to resist you. They don't think about the rationale. They just want to be free to do what they want. The better way is to explain and to allow interaction, but with measured leverage throughout, with a role and a plan set forth to do that. Obviously, there's going to be hurdles for this, but it's better than bombing everybody to smithereens day and night for another 40 years, is it not? Yep.
Thank you, Auqaab. So yes, okay, I see. Yep. Sorry, just catching up with the chat. Apologies, I think I misrepresented Alison's question. So I don't know if Alison, are you able to come off mute? That might be easier than me fudging your question, and maybe put it to Marzieh.
Yes, thank you. I really am very much on the lines that Auqaab was just saying, that where Qazi absolutely and very passionately thinks of the Taliban as one enemy, I think there is some evidence that there are divisions among them, as a sort of spectrum. Some are probably absolutely appalling, and others might be able to see the sense of the kind of arguments that Auqaab was making. It was a matter of finding the Taliban within the pile who are not only fighters and anti-women and so on, but who are persuadable and could be worked with.
Can I respond very briefly to Alison? That when I was there in the 1990s, the Taliban was not composed of just religious hardliners. The Taliban was composed largely of 3 different sections. Yes, good. I mean, surely there's an opportunity. Although there. They're very fluid and so the point is that you can find ways to talk to the right people who are willing to learn. And this is the experience that Taliban will learn. As they govern, they will learn how difficult it is to govern alone. And to be part of the international community, you have to give, not just to take. Then they must compromise on some level. But when you fight, there is no compromise. You polarize. As you polarize, you build distrust and dishonesty and tension and friction and hostility between each other. You're not willing to listen. You will be willing to listen if you're willing to talk. And now we need to give that time, I think. And that could be the change. Professor, this is not about the Taliban. But it's better than killing.
Thank you.
Sorry. sorry, this is not about the Taliban. Is Afghanistan is the government is a terrorist group. I'm Afghani people, we don't want to sit in the table with the terrorist group. Some of this terrorist group is coming from different countries in Afghanistan. How is possible? How is possible a leopard cannot change its spots? If the Taliban want to say today they are a good people, and we don't have a time to go sit with the terrorists and talk about our future. This is my view. This is my point.
Thank you, Marzia. It's really interesting, I think, to hear you're both, you know, have come from a slightly different angle on things, but really interesting to hear your perspectives of the situation of the future. There's a question from Jane in the chat, and we've probably got time for maybe a couple more questions, if that's okay. So, yeah, sorry, time will cut us short, but we really appreciate your expertise here. What is the effect of Hamid Karzai staying in the country? So Marzia or Auqaab. Auqaab, you're on mute if you're trying to answer.
Okay. The truth is, I've got a different opinion of. I've met the chap a few times. Whether it was a National Defense University, whether it was an international conference, I met him personally. The truth is, we've got to understand that he was a UNICAL official within the management and buddies with Bush at the time. So he was naturally chosen because of that. He faced opposition. He was against the Taliban. There's no doubt about that. But I think we've got to look at the future now. You can't impose a new leader on the country that doesn't want to have puppets imposed upon them. That's what we've got to appreciate. That's what the fight was all about, the independence of that. You see, people can label the Taliban as a terrorist group, and I agree. The acts that committed were horrific. But I also understand the military aspect of that they utilize these actions as a guerrilla campaign to intimidate the government and to win it eventually. The fact of the matter is, you've got to be pretty calculated and cold when you understand the mathematics of it all. If I see it that way, if I'm emotional all the time, I won't be able to see the cloud from the cloud of emotion in front of me. So I've got to see it dispassionately and understand that the world cannot impose leaders on other countries. And this is what happened at the beginning. The problem is they also imposed a system that was alien to the country, although I actually believe in democracy. But that country has to develop its own understanding of democracy, and it has to develop that over time. And if it's imposed, then there will be sections within that society that absolutely resist because they see this as a foreign imposition. Any country would be like that. It's not just the Afghans. So I don't really see anybody such as Karzai coming back at all. I think and imposing somebody else again would mean another military intervention, which would cost trillions again. And I don't think the US is at all in any way want to do that, because their main focus now is China and Russia. They don't want to put any more money into something like this adventure where they're lost as well. So they want to focus on maintaining or retaining global power and the global economic system that they've developed over the last many decades. And that's more of a priority than putting money into Afghanistan now, as far as they're concerned.
Thank you, Auqaab. I can see Marzia, you've had a long day. Maybe just yes. If you want to say thank you to everyone and sort of leave parting words, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pete. And thank you again for organizing this program. And thank you to Jean, Margareta, and Peter, and the people they joined this program because of Afghanistan. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. The same name, Qazi Marzia Babakar Khel. I never changed my ID because I'm from Afghanistan, and I born with this name, and I came in this country the same name and the same ID. So thank you so much for everybody, and the views always is not the same because I'm a woman. I left my country. I know the Taliban, and it's a good phrase in English. Really, I like this one. The English saying, they saying, I think is the proof is in the pudding. We will see is not about our view. It's about the reality in Afghanistan. I'm talking about the reality. I'm not talking about the philosophy of things. I'm just talking about the reality, because every minute we was in the event, I put this event through to some of people in Afghanistan, and they send me a lot of opposite messages. So for me, this is important, my people and the voice of people in Afghanistan. So thank you so much again, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nazir. Thank you for your impassioned talk.
Thank you again for having me here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you. We've really appreciated your very
thank you so much. Thank you, Beth.
But very equally interesting and enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Have a good night. Bye.
Great. We've still got about 1,000 messages in the chat box or questions for you, Auqaab. So maybe you're on social media as well. So maybe if people want to get in touch with you, they can sort of find you that way as well.
You can get in touch via the name down here on Facebook if you like. I use that as my tribal designation, my Alizai Durrani. So that's just my background. So rather than Auqaab Malik, actually Auqaab is the correct way to spell my name. My father got it wrong. I was 3 days old and I didn't have a choice in it. So, but that's just the way things are.
Well, thank you to both of you once again. We really enjoyed your talks, and really we feel we know much more now than we did when we started. Very, very complicated and in many ways very troubling situation. Thank you. I'd like, before we all disperse, I'd also like to thank very much two people. First of all, Councillor Margarita Morton, who's our Deputy Chair of the local branch. I'd like to thank her for all her support and hard work in finding speakers and getting the show on the road. So thank you very much, Margarita. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank Councillor Pete Lidstone for all his help, for your sound advice and practical help in putting this event on Eventbrite, and for managing the IT and this evening's timing and the questions in the chat. So thank you very much. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for coming along. So close to Christmas, I think it's brilliant that you all took the time to join our event. So it's really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jane, as well, for organising.
Yes, thank you, Jane.
It's gone.
Good.
The end.
Good.
Yeah, indeed. I'm off to watch Rory Stewart's documentary. I didn't realise